Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc have been disqualified from the US Grand Prix after their cars were found to be in breach of the technical regulation relating to plank or skid wear. But what does this mean? Why were they disqualified? And why wasn't anybody else? A few hours after the checkered flag on the US Grand Prix, the FIA released a document saying that the skids on cars 16 and 44, that's Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, were found to be not in compliance with Article 3.5.9 of the Formula 1 technical regulations during their routine post-race scrutineering. Mercedes and Ferrari were invited to hearings with the stewards about this, and an hour or so later it was revealed that both drivers had been disqualified from the Grand Prix due to technical non-compliance. So what does this mean? Scrutineering is the process by which technical delegates from the FIA check that a team, driver and car all meet the Formula 1 technical regulations. This happens before the weekend's events begin, but crucially after qualifying for the Grand Prix, either on a Friday for a sprint or Saturday in the normal format, when Parc Fermé inspections are carried out. These inspections are also done after the Grand Prix on a Sunday. The FIA publishes their findings from every check they complete, but only in a general sense unless a violation is found, in which case they will publish a precise figure of which part or aspect of the car was non-compliant and why or by how much. The technical director for the FIA, Joe Bauer, writes up this report and refers a matter of non-compliance to the stewards for their consideration. They will then invite the involved team's representatives to a hearing where they can explain why their car was or was not following the regulations, and the stewards may then issue a penalty. But what penalties can they issue for a technical regulation breach? It's important to differentiate technical regulation breaches from sporting regulation breaches, as the penalties that can be applied differ for the two sets of regulations. While they're technically part of the same rulebook, F1 sporting regulations concern rules about the drivers, races, teams and the championship, and relates to things like points scored or flags, while its technical regulations are about how the cars are constructed and run, and concerns things like how big a chassis can be, or in this case, how much wear a plank can sustain during a race. If a driver or team breaks a sporting regulation, they'll receive a penalty like the ones we most commonly see during a race, a 5 or 10 second penalty or grid drop for the next race. But if a technical regulation is broken, we could see a driver having to take a pit lane start or having a grid drop. But if the breach may have given the driver an advantage in the race, the stewards can disqualify them. This is exactly what we saw in Lewis and Charles' case, but their disqualification implies that they could have gained an advantage from their non-compliant parts. So how would this have worked? To understand this, we first need to look at what was found to be non-compliant on their cars, and this is part of the car called the plank. The plank was first introduced in the era of safety measures following Senna's crash to ensure that teams don't run their cars too low. While it's called a plank, it's actually made from a glass-filled resin rather than wood, and is intended to wear away if the car runs too low. In the ground effect era of cars we are currently in, there is more performance to be found the lower the teams can run their cars. But by doing so, they risk wearing away the plank, and so have to find the right balance when setting their car up for the weekend. It's also important for teams to consider the track's characteristics in this setup, and this could be where Mercedes and Ferrari went wrong. COTA is a notoriously bumpy track, and with the only 1 hour of practice before qualifying in Parc Fermé conditions in this weekend's sprint format, they likely went wrong in setup and made their ride heights too low. By having a low ride height for a Grand Prix duration around COTA, the track's bumps wore away at Lewis and Charles' car's planks, such that its thickness dipped below the allowed 9mm. So why was it only Charles and Lewis who got disqualified for this? Surely other drivers had this problem when trying to set up their cars in the short time frame of the sprint format. We may never know whether or not drivers, other than those whose cars were sampled and checked, were within or outside of the plank wear regulations. When conducting their post-race scrutineering, the FIA use a computer to randomly select which cars they check the planks of, but typically they will also conduct full checks of at least some of the front-running cars. In this case, the FIA checked the cars of Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, and of course Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, but only Lewis and Charles' cars were non-compliant. This random checking protocol means that teams of course can't predict if or when their car will be checked, so always have to be within the restrictions. It's necessary because the FIA don't have the time following a Grand Prix to check all 60 scrutineering inspection points on all 20 cars before the teams need to be flying the cars out to the next race. But this doesn't mean that cars outside of these four escaped any random checks. In fact, the FIA conduct random checks of the front floor, fuel, engine oil and tyre temperatures before the race, certain aerodynamic components and floor and plank wear after the race. With a non-compliance rate of 50% in the cars the FIA checked the planks of at the US Grand Prix, it is likely that there were others in the field who were also running too low and suffered excessive plank wear, but this random selection protocol means we'll likely never know. Lewis and Charles' disqualification was a very unusual event and something that rarely happens in F1 these days, but it may be a consequence of the sprint format and the limited practice time teams get, coupled with the bumpy track at COTA. Mercedes and Ferrari will have learned valuable lessons from this that they can take away into a future sprint race weekend. What did you make of this news? Let us know in the comments, like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to Apex for more deep dives into the F1 world.